little while ago, I created my very first home scanning film setup with the help of my friend Kyle, largely trying to create the setup for as small of a budget as possible. Since putting together that setup and releasing that video, I've been going through the process of rescanning every single 35mm and 120 frame of film that I've ever shot. During this process, I've made a few improvements and upgrades, and I think that how I now scan my film at home is absolutely perfect for me. So let's talk about it. Wanting to make these upgrades stemmed from a couple of teething issues that I found with my initial setup. The first one was that the lens that I was using was not a 1:1 magnification macro lens, and I actually had to use extension tubes in order to shoot both 35mm and 120 film, and I had to take off that extension tube when setting up the camera as well. Another issue that was manageable but personally not ideal was that the Sony FX30 small screen just didn't seem to convey the entirety of the image, and I couldn't be 100% sure where the negative lined up with the edge of the frame. And in fact, it felt like the screen actually only showed maybe 85 to 90% of the image, and so I was getting a lot of border and thus a slightly lower resolution image. This also made it a little bit difficult to focus accurately, as I had to try and rely on the focus peaking, and I wasn't always able to clearly see that I was focused on the grain of the negative. Going through all my old negatives and rescanning them at home also meant that I needed a new archival and storage situation, both physically and the digital scanned files. I was just using some old binders with the negatives stored in there completely disorganized before, and my scans were stored on a pretty slow hard drive just labeled with the original numbered folder that the lab sent me when they scanned it. So if I wanted to go back and find some old images or look at some old negatives, it was pretty much a case of searching through folders or through the physical binder until I lucked onto what it was that I was searching for. Definitely not ideal. So to tackle these issues, I wanted to try and streamline the process to make it more enjoyable, practically more efficient, better organized, whilst also ensuring that I get the highest quality scans that I can, without spending thousands and thousands of pounds on lab grade equipment. So let's dive in and first off talk about the lens upgrade. The lens I opted to change to was once again a recommendation from Kyle, who had used it in one of his recent budget setups, and that lens is the FD mount Vivitar 55mm f2.8 macro. This lens is a 1:1 magnification macro lens, and this means that I can leave it mounted on my FX30 when leveling my film scanning setup, as well as when changing between 35mm and 120 format film, without the need to add or remove any extension tubes at any point. It's definitely saved a lot of time in the setting up of this home scanning rig. Personally, I found this lens to be incredibly sharp, and I shoot it at around f5.6. Whilst I haven't done any extensive testing with sharpness charts, I found that aperture to be more than usable, and with some quick research online, it seems as though f5.6 and f8 are pretty comparable and the two best options to use when scanning. I do leave the lens wide open when focusing just to get critical focus, and then I step down when starting to scan the film. The aperture ring is a nice clickable aperture, and it's easy to see what I have it set to and to be confident that it's not going to change during the scanning. The focus ring also is a lot nicer than the old Canon lens that I used previously, and it's very easy to just minutely adjust the lens, ensuring that I nail that focus. The added bonus of using a lens like this is that I've now started to incorporate some macro style B-roll shots in my videos, and personally I think that this gives a pretty nice look. So that was the lens situation sorted. My scanning workflow was immediately made more efficient and retained a high level of quality, but the next issue that I wanted to sort was ensuring that I captured as much of the negative as possible and really dialing in the critical focus. So I decided to mount a 7-inch monitor to my setup on a permanent basis. Now I use an Atomos Shinobi full-time for my video work, and I pair that with the FX30 or the Pocket 6K Pro if I'm using that, and I didn't want to have to continually remove the monitor from my scanning setup to use it on video projects and then put it back when I wanted to scan film. I wanted it to just be a more permanent solution. The monitor that I opted for is actually an old video monitor that I picked up and used many years ago when I was starting out just learning about videography, and that is the Lilliput A7S. I honestly forgot that I owned this monitor. It had been sat in the bottom of a big storage roller case for years, and it actually has a couple of small dents in it that it's picked up from being stored away, but it still works perfectly well. As I said, I did want to make this a permanent solution, and so for me, clamping the monitor to the copy stand was was the best idea. To do this, I picked up a small rig super clamp. I personally love these. I use these all the time. They're super strong and could even hold my FX30 with a pretty decent weight lens, and I generally use them for multiple things. Right now it's holding a microphone. I often use it to hold a sound recorder. They're just so versatile. And using it in this application, being able to position this monitor in any orientation just off to the side of the scanning setup has meant that I barely even have to look at the FX30 screen. The monitor I use in its most simple form, I just have a clean feed coming out of the FX30, and so now I can see the entirety of the frame, and this means I can lower or raise my camera to ensure that the negative takes up as much of the image frame as possible, and I can be certain that there's no parts of the image that I'm not seeing. I leave the FX30 screen folded out just so that I can check the histogram and double check that the aperture priority setting is giving me a correct exposure, but I don't use any of the exposure tools on the monitor. This monitor also helps out with getting critical focus, as it's really easy to see on the bigger 7-inch screen what comes in and out of focus. I can zoom in on my camera, and with the monitor I can see pretty clearly when the grain of the film comes into focus. I've personally not run into any focusing issues since incorporating this into my setup, and it's made the initial focusing period so much faster. So those first two upgrades were really quality of life upgrades that both streamlined and made my scanning process more enjoyable, but also ensured that I was getting the highest quality of scan every single time. The final two upgrades that I want to talk about today are in regard to storing the negatives and ensuring that I stay organized with my processing of my scanned files. Firstly, I picked up some storage binders and hard-cased folders from a photographic store on eBay. They're a nice solid material, and I like the fact that the binder comes with a sort of hard case sleeve that protects the negatives and provides just a really neat overall solution. I've initially picked up 3 of these binders, 2 for 35mm negatives and 1 for 120 medium format negatives. I also purchased some little sticky labels of varying sizes, using some larger ones to mark which binders are which, and I've put a smaller sticker on the Kenro storage sheets that I use. On these smaller stickers I've put the film stock, the camera that it was shot on, and the location that it was shot in if I know all of that information. I've also then put a corresponding number on the top left of the sticker, which aligns with a folder in my digital storage solution, so that if I'm looking at some scans on my computer or I look at some negatives, I can immediately see what roll of film it's from and find it straight away in the binders, or vice versa in the Lightroom catalog. And that computer storage system is the last upgrade that I've made to my scanning setup that I want to talk about today. I opted for a new SSD to store all of my film rolls on that was purely for that film roll scanning storage, and I went for a Crucial X6, mainly because of how small and portable it is, meaning I could take this around with me anywhere and be able to edit images and access my film scans remotely. I went for the 1TB option, which is more than enough right now for the amount of film that I've shot, and it's been perfectly fast enough to run a Lightroom catalog with all of my scans without any issues. In this Lightroom catalog, I've also tried to remain super organized, having collection sets for both my 35mm and 120 film, and then a separate collection folder for each roll of film, labeled and named with the number that corresponds to the sticky label that I physically placed on the negative sheet. I convert and edit these images in these collections, and then if I've got multiple rolls of film for a project or for a specific YouTube video, I've got a separate collection set for those, and I incorporate the multiple rolls into one collection down there so that I can see all of those images in one folder rather than having to click back and forth between multiple rolls of film. And that's pretty much all of the changes that I've made to my home scanning setup, and I personally feel like what I have now is absolutely perfect for me. I'm used to the setup now, and it's quick and intuitive, and it remains incredibly effective at getting high quality film scans at home. I can load up any images incredibly quickly in Lightroom for YouTube videos or for personal projects or just to revisit old images, and upgrading this setup to what it is today has made the entire process of rescanning all of my old film incredibly fun. That's going to be a couple of videos that I have coming out in the next few months, rescanning every film negative that I have ever shot in both 35mm and 120 formats, revisiting some old projects, learning from them, and sharing some of my favorite images that I'd forgotten that I'd ever taken but were stored in these negative binders. So do stay tuned for that if you're interested in following along this little home film scanning series. But that is going to be all for this one. If you did enjoy, please do leave me a like, let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. I'd love as ever to hear all about your home scanning setups and experiences, and of course do please consider subscribing if you want to see any more of my content going forwards. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.